Back, this is Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and today we're going to continue working on our Sci-Fi crate in Substance Painter. So in a previous tutorial, we baked out our mesh maps, which if I go to the right of my screen and I click on Texture Set Settings and I scroll down, I will see the maps that I've baked depending on what material I have selected. So in the upper right hand corner, you have your texture set list, and inside you have all the different materials. And based on what material you have selected, those are the maps that you'll see plugged in. So when I click on crate, these are all the maps baked onto the crate. If I scroll down and I click on handles, I will see all the maps that I baked onto the handles. Now you'll notice that on the handles, the number 1 shows up here. But when I click on the crate, you see the number 6. That's because there are 6 maps plugged into this node. So the reason there are 6 maps are because of the number of tiles we have here. So we have 6 tiles, therefore 6 maps, all pertaining to this one material that is the base crate. Now if you wanted to, like let's say you were creating something simple like the food can that we made in our first exercise, then the food can might all be in one square and one material, and so you'd only see one set of maps here and only one material listed up here. Okay? So there are 2 different types of maps that you work in Substance Painter. There are the mesh maps, and mesh maps are maps that you bake. So you bake them from either a high poly mesh, in this case what we kicked out of Substance Painter, or you can also fake it by using low poly meshes to bake your maps. The other type are channel maps, and channel maps are the ones you paint, and that's where it gets really, really fun. Now before you start painting, I recommend having some sort of vision that you want to pursue with your crate. You can be as creative and as silly as you want. You can make an underwater crate, a steampunk crate, gosh, any kind of crate you can think of. I don't really care, but I recommend having some sort of vision that you can kind of create a cohesive design out of, so that you're not just kind of throwing things and seeing what sticks. Texturing goes so much faster if you know what direction you want to go. For my crate, for this example, if I click on M, you'll see that I've gone in and textured this crate already, and it's WALL-E themed. So I just looked up a picture of WALL-E online, and then I got silly and decided, okay, how can I apply WALL-E to this crate? And I'm going to walk you all through how to paint this WALL-E crate. I mean, you can do any type of crate you want, but I'm going to show you how I approach this crate. But before we do, we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at the interface. So I'm going to go here and go File, Open Recent. I'm going to open up the Substance Painter file for the Sci-Fi crate that has no textures applied. Well, it has its mesh maps. So if I click on B for baked, I can see all the maps that I baked out, the ambient occlusion, the curvature, etc. If I click on M, it shows me material view. And if I click on C, I can see the different channels, of which we don't really have any, so virtually all of them are empty. But we're going to change that today. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about the interface. By default, you have 2 viewports. On the one side, you have your 3D view, and on the other side, you have your 2D view. So if I click on one of these, like the crate material, I can see the UDEMs that are attached to the crate. If I click on buckles and I press F, so F is the hotkey that refocuses things. If I were to zoom away from my crate, I could press F and bring it back. Same with over here, depending on what UDEMs I'm looking at, I can press F and it can like focus me on a single UDEM or all of them. Yeah, so that's just kind of a helpful hotkey. To zoom in and out, the same hotkeys as you find in Maya. So what I'm specifically clicking on is I'm using Option on the Mac, which is Alt on the PC. And if I right click, I can zoom in and out, zoom in and out. If I middle mouse click, I go side to side, side to side. And if I left mouse click, I can rotate. And you can rotate in here too. And it may not seem logical at first, like, well, why would you want to do this? But trust me, it's actually really, really helpful, especially if you're using stencils. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's a basic way of, kind of maneuvering around in your scene, okay? So previously, we know where the texture sets are about. We know that we can click on any set of sets that we want, and we know we can isolate them. So or maybe you don't know. If you don't know, you can turn on or off any of these materials and isolate a very specific part of your crate that you want to work on. I can also click on the thing I want to view. So in this case, I want to work on the crate itself. And if I click on this eye with a 1 on it, it kind of puts me in a solo mode where I can just focus on just the crate. Okay, so with that clicked, I'm going to get away from texture set settings. I'm already done with my bake maps. I don't need this anymore. And I'm going to click on layers. Now right now I don't have any layers because I deleted them. Typically there is one default layer in your scene. So if you've just opened up your crate, you're going to see one default layer. There are lots of different layers you can create, but when it comes to paintable layers, there's really just two. And that's these two middle buttons right here. There's a default layer, which is your paintbrush tool button here, and then there's a fill layer, which will just wash and flood an entire layer with a single color or a single image or a single filter. You know, it's going to fill everything. So you either fill or you paint. You also have mask layers. So if you took 122, you know how masks work in Photoshop. They work very similarly here, and we're going to review it. So if you don't remember, that's okay. The magic wand tool looking icon here is actually filters. So they're custom filters you can apply to a layer. Over here, you've got materials, and you've got folders so you can organize everything in your workspace. I'm going to go ahead and click on this paintbrush tool, and that creates a layer, and immediately that activates the properties. So let's step away from properties for a moment and go to the far left of our screen. Over here you've got a toolbar, you've got a paintbrush tool, an eraser tool. This is a projection tool, we're not going to play with that much. The polygon fill tool, you've got smudge and clone, which are so great for fixing up seams, and you've got, of course, a material picker tool. Down here, these are things that have to do with the Substance Painter website as far as kind of looking at community assets, and you don't have to worry about those things right now. Right now, we're really focused on these top buttons. Now, I'm going to click on the paintbrush tool, and when I do, you'll notice that there are settings here and there are settings down in the properties view. So the settings up here allow you to adjust the size and the flow and the stroke opacity and the spacing of your brush. Over here in properties, if I scroll to the very top, you'll see there's size, flow, spacing, etc. So this is like a shortcut view of what's over here in properties. So if I have in my layers menu a single default layer and I go to my crate, I can just paint a stroke. Okay, and it's going to look like what my properties reflect, which is this is the look of the brush I'm using, and over here is the color that I'm painting with. Okay, so I'm painting with a somewhat soft brush with a solid white. Okay, I can adjust any of these settings by just grabbing this scroll bar and scrolling down, and there are a lot of different settings, and once you start plugging things in, these settings become more and more robust and more nuanced. Up here, you've got some really cool shortcut buttons that will basically drop you down to the menu faster. So if I click here, it scrolls me down to the alpha section. If I click here, down to stencil, and here down to material. So you got brush, alpha, stencil, material. That's what these four buttons are. And if you forget them, just click them and you'll see where they take you. But it's all just this one big page under properties. Okay? So the brush tool is super familiar. If you've worked in Photoshop and you've taken 122, you recognize a lot of these things from the custom brush menu in Photoshop, which you'd activate by pressing F5 in Photoshop. So you would be able to adjust the size, and there's a minimum size in case you're working on a tablet so that you can control pressure sensitivity. Flow and opacity, which has to do with kind of the transparency option. You've got spacing so that you could stagger out some of these, some of the outputs. You can play with some jitters. So there's size jitter, there's a flow jitter, there's an angle jitter, which you can't really see much change with because it's a round shape, so you're not going to see it rotate really. But if you had a specific shape like a star, you'd see that each tip was rotating. And then of course position jitter kind of creates a little bit more of a scattered effect. The more changes you make, the more lag you might experience in your scene. So if I go ahead and I start painting with this brush, you'll see that it creates a cool speckled effect. Now let's say that you want to keep this brush. You can right click and say create a tool preset, and so you'll be able to come back to this. Or you can also choose a brush preset. I think the difference is that tool preset also takes the material with it, and the brush preset will keep the brush without fussing about what the material, and we'll talk about the material here in a moment. If you save a custom brush, to see it, you go over here to your shelf. So your shelf has all sorts of input in it. It's got materials. If you click on these different buttons, you'll see the different options. You've got smart materials, you have masking options, you have filters that you can play with, you've got different brush strokes. A little paintbrush will show you the different alpha map options. You've got custom alpha maps so that you can apply a whole library of options to a brush or bring in your own. There are textures that you can bring in, and there are, of course, these are different panoramas. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So if I go over here and I click on, this is my library, but if I go over here, I can say what my assets are, and you can see some of the materials that I've created under Materials tab. If I go to Brush tab, you'll see there are my brush presets. So when I click on this, I'm able to bring a brush back based on what I saved. Okay, so I can save custom materials out. So if I right click, if I make this material, you know what, let's scroll down to the material setting. So this is where you can kind of change things like color. If I change this to a blue, for instance, and I right click and I say, hey, save this material preset, it'll save that specific material color inside your materials under your assets. If you want to get rid of some stuff, you can right click and delete. You don't have to keep them. And then of course there's the brushes. Okay, so those are under your assets. Otherwise you just go main project library. Okay, so let's get back to this. Under brush, we've already covered that. Down here under alpha, this is where you can kind of change your custom shape. So if I go under the alpha library, notice this button that kind of looks like a little checkered circle. The same icon exists in your shelf. And so you can go ahead and choose alphas like maybe this atom. That looks kind of cool. So now you can really see the changes in the brush. If I go back to brush now and I were to turn on and activate an angle jitter, now you can see that each of these is rotating a little bit. And if I were to up the scale and paint, you can now see that it's painting with a little blue atom symbol. So that's the alpha, and there are different parameters that you can play with under there, but generally speaking, it's just enough to know that you want to plug in an alpha. You can also delete an alpha, and you'll see that by default it's a little square. And then you can click on this to load alphas, and you can even bring your own custom alpha into your scene, which I'll show you how to do a little bit later. But for right now, let's go ahead and just stick with something. We'll go click that atom again just so we have something attached to our brush. All right, so the next step is materials. So under materials, right now we only have color activated. If I turn off color, then we're left with just a plain dull white. But if I activate color, I can choose any color that I want by clicking on this big white or blue or whatever color rectangle. By default, it's usually white. But if I click on this, I can choose any color that I want, any hue. I can desaturate or saturate that hue. I can make it darker or lighter. Also, I can go ahead and put a specific texture in. So like this camo, for example. Now I'm actually using an image to paint with. And so you'll see that it's a little hard to see, honestly. Let's choose something a little bit bigger for our alpha, like these bells. You'll see that these bells are camo colored now. So it's not just a color you're stuck with. You can also choose an image to paint with, which is kind of cool. And that's color. You also have all these other channels that you can play with. Now, some of you might be a little confused looking at my screen because you're like, wait, what's OP and what's emiss? Opacity means that I can paint transparency on my scene, and emissive maps are maps that can emit light. Now, when you first go into Substance Painter and you say, hey, I want to create a new scene like we did in the previous tutorial, most of you selected PBR, metallic roughness, either alpha blend or algorithmic. So algorithmic was the default, and Alpha Blend is just it's a little bit more, has more options, but it's basically the same thing. So if you are working on an older version, you might see just metallic roughness with algorithmic written in parentheses instead of starter assets. If you're working on a more updated version, then you have different options. But they're virtually the same. I just have these extra maps. Now, if that's confusing for you, or maybe you want these maps, you can go to texture set settings and you can change that because none of this is set in stone. If I go into my texture set settings and I go down to channels, these are all the channels available to me. I can click minus on emissive and minus on opacity, and you'll notice in the properties that those maps disappear. I don't have to have those maps. If I want to bring them back, I can click on the plus sign and I can plug in any of these maps back in. Or I can go with unsupported maps, maps that don't really apply to this specific shader type, but that's a different story. So yeah, so if there's a channel missing that you want to summon or a channel that you want to get rid of, you can go to the texture set settings under channels and take care of that. Okay, back to layers. I went ahead and got rid of them just so you're less confused, because these are basically the channels we're going to be playing with. So under base color, again, click the swatch. You can change it to whatever color you feel like. And under, or you can apply an image. Height maps. So what are height maps? Height maps are maps that create a sense of depth. So if I were to start painting with this weird bell that I've created, actually I kind of want to get rid of that. I'm going to go to my brush tool over here and I'm going to look for my basic card. There we go. I prefer to paint with this. Okay, so let's say that I'm painting and I have height set to 0. You're not going to notice anything. However, if I set height all the way to -1, notice that there is now a bit of depth to the stroke. And if I go the opposite direction, +1, now it seems to be extruding out as opposed to pressing in. So height just gives you another option of creating a little bit of depth on your surface. Now, notice up here when we were talking about these different options, it's very similar to Photoshop. You've even got blending modes. You can create lots of different layers and blend them together. You can create custom maps and stuff. You'll notice that there's this bigger drop-down window that says base color. Well, when you're coloring, you are actually coloring on multiple channels. These are all the channel maps that you might be painting on. In this case, we're only painting on the base color, but when we activate height, we're also painting on this height map here. Now, to see that difference, you can just press C in your menu. So remember when we pressed B, we were able to look at all our baked maps. If I press C, I can look at the different channels. So this is what my color map looks like right now. If I press C again, there's my height map. Remember, it acts in binary, so black is going to press in, white is going to press out, gray is going to be in the middle, so it's like 1, 0, and in between. Okay, and of course I don't have any other maps right now, so I'm just going back to material. So that's what happens when you activate height map. Okay, the other one is roughness map. So this is similar to specular map. However, roughness takes into account reflectivity, or the default of reflectivity, where specular is just going to add a little bit of sheen. Roughness can actually interact with the reflectiveness of PBR. So if I turn roughness all the way to black, and I was to start painting on this, you'll notice that I'm able to see a shiny reflection. If I were to turn it all the way off, it becomes a matte color that doesn't really reflect light at all. It's just absorbing all the light. Now, something you might notice, well, first off, you're probably going to want to, with roughness, keep it like at the default of like 0.3 or so that you're getting a little bit of reflection, but not a whole ton, unless you have a very specific material you're going for. It kind of feels like a shiny plastic. If I were to turn it all the way off and it has that reflectiveness to it, some of you might notice that, wait a minute, is that a sky? What is happening there? Okay, so you may not see it by default, but you're actually working inside of a rendered space. Well, it's not technically rendered yet, but it's a space that can be rendered. And you're using image-based lighting just like you would in Marmoset. And just like in Marmoset, you've got an environment. To see that environment, go to the right hand corner of your screen. See that little screen button there? If you click on it, you're able to look at your display settings. And if I turn up my environmental opacity, oh, there's an environment. And if I turn off the environmental blur, it's the same environment that is being reflected here in this paint. So that's kind of fun. I'm going to go ahead and turn this back to what it was and turn off the opacity. Also, you can choose lots of different environments. You don't have to go with the default. Just like in Marmoset, there's lots of options here, but we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Oh, also, fun fact, if you hold down Shift and you, Shift and you left mouse click, or I'm sorry, right mouse click. I get a little discombobulated. If you shift right mouse click, you can actually rotate your environment. So if the lighting is bad on one side and you want to see it in better lighting, you can actually rotate. Again, that's shift right click. And so now everything's a little bit shinier. All right, so that's what roughness does. So we're now painting with color, height, and roughness because all three of these channels are turned on. Metalness is really fun. Usually a metal map is either going to be all black or all white. You're not going to see like a whole lot of variation unless, I guess, if you're creating a layered map, but even then you would just have the non-metal map layered on top of the metal map. There just wouldn't be a ton of difference. Generally speaking, it's a solid color. If I'm painting with metal, it's going to be all the way to, you can either turn it off, so when I paint off, there's no metalness. If I turn it all the way on, it's going to have more of a metallic look to it. And so you're going to see sharper reflections when you have roughness on. And it's really quite fun. Now, while we have this up, I want to talk about the eraser tool a little bit. This eraser tool has its own settings. So you can play with the brush shape, the alpha, and the stencil. But in materials, you're actually saying what you want to erase. So if I click on all of these, it's going to erase all of them. But, let's undo there. If I tell it to only erase the color, then it's going to keep the other maps. So that can be really fun. With roughness and metal turned all the way on, you get a mirror. So that's kind of fun. It's a cool mirror type effect. Alrighty. So going back into my brush tool, that's what metal does. And of course you can paint with normals. I don't really recommend messing with this too much, but if there's something specific you want to do, so I'm going to turn everything off except for the normal. And I'm going to click on the normal box, and you'll see that there are all these texture options, some of which look like normal maps. If I click on one of these, like this circle button map, and I just paint, not mind you, I'm not painting with color or height or anything, just the normal at the moment. And I go over here and just paint it on my scene, I have effectively painted into my normal map. And what Substance Painter is going to do is it's going to combine your big normal map with your painted normal map channel, which is pretty nice when you export. But yeah, anything that you paint onto your normals will, appear to alter that mesh a little bit. So if I click on C, there's there's what the normal and the height and the mesh maps all combined kind of look like. If I go back to material, you can see just all the craziness. And there is a lot of craziness here. So I'm going to click on this layer and just get rid of it and create a new layer. And I'm going to go back to so clicking on my brush, I'm going to click on my basic brush again, just get back to that. And I'm going to get rid of normal and just turn on color for right now. Okay, so let's see, what are some other things that we should discuss? Oh, maybe you noticed that while I was painting, I was scaling my brush up and down. Let's talk about those hotkeys real quick. They can be really helpful as far as time efficiency. Any of these settings can be changed on the fly over here in the properties menu or at the top of your screen, but there are some really cool hotkeys. If I click on Control, or in the case of my Mac, I hold down Command, and I left mouse click left and right, it controls my flow. If I left mouse click up and down, it's rotating my brush, which again, you don't really notice that much because it's a round brush. But let's say I chose a brush with some texture to it, like maybe this brush with, Actually, that's a particle brush. I don't want to use that. Yeah, like this leaf brush here. Oh no, something with some shape to it. Tire treads. So if I were to scale this up, you can see I can rotate my brush. So holding down Control and dragging with my left mouse up and down will rotate it on the fly, or I can click side to side and it deals with the flow. Now if I right mouse click, I can scale up and down, or if I go up and down with my click, I can, well, yeah, that scales it. And then, oh, sorry, hold on. I'm getting a little discombobulated. All right, so side to side, holding down Control, side to side scales it. Moving up and down, it's still scaling. That's not what it's supposed to be doing. Hold on a second. Control, maybe I'm just not going up and down enough. Scaling, scaling. Everything is scaling. Maybe it's the type of brush I'm working with, because it definitely has another option. Let me go here and try this. So I've scaled it up. There we go. Notice that inner outer ring? It's because there really wasn't an option on that previous brush. That's the softness and the hardness of your brush. So you can change those things on the fly by holding down Control and then either dragging your left or your right mouse button up and down or side to side. It's not important that you remember those, but it can be a helpful tool. So those are the basics of using the brush and the eraser tool. This tutorial is already pretty long, and so I'm going to go ahead and continue exploring the Sci-Fi Crate and all of the options available in our next tutorial, and I'm going to cut this one now.